Good evening. I'm James Bardrick, Citi Country Officer for the UK, and we're delighted that you were able to join this public programming event of the Citi exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate. Our association with the British Museum started with the 2012 sponsorship of the Citi Money Gallery. Telling the story of the very foundation and evolution of money over history was our way of marking the celebration of our own 200-year anniversary. In 2018, we embarked on the next chapter of our support as we launched the Citi Exhibition Series. This is our 5-year commitment to bringing to life the incredible world collection of the British Museum through special exhibitions. We see the British Museum as one of the most important global guardians of human history, and we truly value the fact that our support enables the museum to continue with its groundbreaking exhibitions and its renowned education programs. And as a global bank, our mission is simple. We responsibly provide financial services that enable growth and economic progress to the clients and communities that we serve. And that service spans over 160 markets globally, including the circumpolar north. And in staging the Citi exhibition, Arctic Culture and Climate, the museum is using the fabulous collection and many loans from the region to explore the sheer ingenuity and resilience of humankind. That incredible adaptability and resourcefulness has allowed the indigenous people of the Arctic to live in balance for nearly 30,000 years. But as we know, it's an existence and balance that is increasingly under threat. We believe that the show and its content can be additive to the conversation on climate change and a further rallying cry for humankind to use that same ingenuity and adaptability to tackle the challenges facing the Arctic region and our whole planet. Citi has been incorporating environmental, social and climate change into our financing for more than 20 years. And as the issue of climate change is accelerating, we're also accelerating our efforts to transform our business. In July of this year, Citi released its 2025 Sustainable Progress Strategy. The strategy includes a commitment to increase our financing of environmental and climate solutions and includes a new $250 billion environmental finance goal. We're also committed to decreasing climate risk and the impact of our lending and investments through the incorporation of newly emerged tools to analyse climate risk and accelerate the transition. And importantly, to disclose our process and our results. And finally, we continue to a commitment to managing and reducing the direct impact of our own facilities, which number 7,000 around the world in 97 countries. Our 2025 strategy includes goals to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 45%, our energy use by 40%, and we are on track to source 100% of our electricity globally from renewable energy sources by the end of this year. We sincerely hope that at some point you'll be able to attend the exhibition in person. If not, we hope that this event serves as a testament to the museum's mission of making its collection available to a global and increasingly diverse audience. And so without further ado, it really does give me great pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage Professor Julia Black, President-elect of the British Academy, who are the organisational partners of today's event, as well as former Governor of the Bank of England and Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance, Mark Carney, for a discussion about how, when and if the world really can become net carbon zero. Professor Black, over to you.
So welcome everybody, and thank you very much to Citi and for the sponsorship of this exhibition and for your support for the British Museum in the past. Mark, it's very good to see you. And I think the film we've just seen and the exhibition itself are a really powerful demonstration of the connection between the people of the Arctic, their cultures, their identities, and their natural environment. And perhaps they're a good reminder that climate change is a social problem as much as it is a technological one. So in your view, if the world is to attain net zero within the time span that's needed, how important do you think it is to recognise that social dimension of climate change and perhaps reconsider the relationship between people's cultures and identities and the natural world in which we live?
Well, thank you for having me, Julia, and to the British Academy for putting this on, and of course to the British Museum for the exhibit, and Citi for their sponsorship. Incredibly important issue, and I think it gets to the heart of it, of bringing it into the much bigger context, because it's very easy, and I'm sure we will spend a bit of this time talking about the engineering solutions to climate change and the economic and financial architecture that needs to be put in place in order to get there. But ultimately, and I think as the exhibit, the question it asks and to some extent answers, is that this is it is a cultural issue. It is a social and cultural issue, that climate change is man-made. We have set up certain systems, and we have to some extent detached ourselves, or in some respects totally detached ourselves from nature, and that has led to these consequences. And of course, in the Arctic, I'm originally from the region. And what comes through in the exhibit, what I've been able to see virtually and read, but what I know a bit from my past, is that the nature of that society, those indigenous societies in the circumpolar region, it's integral to the climate, it's integral to the land, it's integral to the ocean, it's integral to nature, and they are not separate. The Inuit of Canada are not separate from nature, and that has a number of consequences. One of them is there is less of a sense, or there's not a sense of entitlement to nature. So in other words, that many of the rituals and I think it comes through in some of the art that is at the exhibit. Rituals around hunting, for example, are to ask for permission, for forgiveness, and recognize the gift that is given from the land or from the ocean. And I think one of the things that culturally what has happened is that we have separated ourselves in many respects as society from nature. We see our ability to dip into nature, take things from them, not necessarily return to it. And I remember this kind of being hammered home to me when partly as a consequence of climate change. Of course, the sea ice is not fully returning in many summers in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic. And for some, this was a wonderful opportunity for Arctic drilling for oil and gas. I mean, they saw this unique opportunity. I mean, I smile about it, but there's actually nothing funny about it, really, because it's the actual cause of the event. The burning of fossil fuels creates this, in many respects, a horrific opportunity. And if you view yourselves as apart from nature, taking from nature, then you only see that opportunity. You don't understand the damage, or you don't appreciate the damage that's there. So I think there is a deeply cultural aspect. What the exhibit brings forth is a difficult life, but a life that's lived in balance with nature and in appreciation of nature. And part of the answer to addressing climate change for us all, wherever we live in the world, is rediscovering that and rediscovering a hierarchy in terms of our relationship to nature, to the planet, across generations, and then shifting from the cultural and the social to the engineering, economic, and practical. In other words, what are we going to do about it given the situation that we now find ourselves in?
Thank you. I think that's a really interesting observation there about distancing, connection, and our disconnect, and how that means that we're responding to risks. I mean, we've had warnings of climate change for decades, and yet governments around the world and us as citizen consumers have been very slow to act, because it always seems so far away. It's for somebody else to deal with, some other generation, some other society, some other time, some other place. And people also say, well, listen, people have adapted in the past. We've had climate change, through eons. It's adapted, we'll adapt again. So I'm just wondering, from your reflections, what can we learn from how we have and haven't responded to climate change, and indeed to other types of risks, for how we need to respond right now, how we need to change and to respond right now?
Well, it's interesting. I'll make a couple points maybe on that. It's a big question, and some may not know that we know each other professionally from our work at one of the committees at the Bank of England, and of course you have much broader work in these areas. But one of the things we think about is around systemic risks and the nature of systemic risks, and of course the classic risk with some of those watching may remember, a classic manifestation of that was in the financial crisis of 12 years ago. It seems a very long time ago now, but 12 years ago, where warnings were ignored, individual institutions only focused on individual transactions, not what was happening with the system as a whole. Those who were supposed to oversee it were a bit captured by the myth that finance was self-regulating and that if you had markets on markets, all would be well. And in other words, not looking at the bigger picture and not looking across time. We had a terrible crisis, great pain, great lost decade effectively in the United Kingdom amongst elsewhere. And the response to that has been a series of regulations and steps that have made it less likely to happen again. And in fact, with the COVID crisis, I think we've seen some of the strength of the financial system. But with that long preamble, I'm always very conscious, and I know you are as well, and our colleagues at the bank, is that this is the time when in the financial system risks start to build up because you start to become complacent. The last financial crisis was a long time ago. We lived through this one. Maybe the system is strong. If the regulators would just get out of the way, why are we always worrying about things? Why don't we let banks do, have some fancy new product, which in many cases is old wine in new bottles, or new wine in old bottles, I guess, depending on how you want to misrepresent. And one of the challenges in our world is that the world of finance is that success is an orphan. In other words, if you take the steps in order to prevent bad things from happening, it's a counterfactual. You never really see the bad thing happen. So you're always subject to the charge that you've done too much. Okay. With climate, we have had similar issues. There's been very clear, I think, for those who followed it, very clear science in building risks in the system, but it's not tangible every day. The measures that need to be taken feel inconvenient, feel alarmist, feel extreme, and there's a willingness to put it off to another day. And it's a very human nature. I have a long list of things I can tell you on my desk that I'll put off to another day, procrastination. But I try to make sure that I deal with the big systemic issues in a timely fashion. And this is what we need to do with climate. And I think, unfortunately, what's happened is we've now reached a position where we're starting to see the physical manifestations of climate change are becoming so overwhelming that it's spurring action. It would have been better if we had acted on this 20 years ago. We can't get that time back, but we're in a position now, and I'll try and before I hand it back to you, bring it to the to be tangible and think about what's happening in the Arctic and what's happening more broadly. We are seeing, as I said a moment ago, where the sea ice is the Northwest Passage is basically opening up in the summer, which never happened. We have seen about a 20 centimeter rise in sea levels. We are seeing the beginning of the melting of the permafrost, which is a layer, as you know, below the surface. In fact, in that video we had at the start, if somebody may have noticed that all the houses I think it was probably in Iqaluit, judging the town, but are on stilts, and they're on stilts because the expansion and contraction of permafrost, which naturally happens in the summer. So everything has to be built to take into account. What's happening now is that is melting, and that could use up more than a third, potentially half of our remaining carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. That's one of the big tipping points that's in the system. So we're getting to a point as well where, and there's different estimates, and I'll take a median of it, but since I was born, we have lost about 50% of the species. Some estimates are as high as 70. So only now is there that social groundswell, if I go back to your first question, that is really not calling for action, but shouting for action on this issue. And it falls to us to determine how to do that.
No, for sure. And one of the things that's curious, you referenced there was, as you say, role in financial crisis, but also one of the initiatives you pioneered in your role as a governor of the Bank of England and chair of the Financial Stability Board is to, in a way, it's to reorientate the financial system, or persuade the financial system it should reorientate itself so that it takes into account exposure to climate risks through various initiatives, and most recently the bank through the requirement for the major banks and insurance companies to evaluate their exposure to climate change under different scenarios. But there are some pushbacks against that, aren't there? There are some who argue, well, listen, it's not, finance is a peripheral part of addressing climate change. Climate change shouldn't really be part of a central concern of central bankers, financial regulators. And yet we heard at the beginning as well that Citi, this is a very core part, for example, of their initiative. It is for others as well. So what way do you think the global financial system does have a critical role to play in enabling us to achieve net zero?
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely has a critical role. And there's the first question, which is a more narrow but important question that you asked within that, which is, if we look at it from the perspective of a regulator, a central bank, and if you will, around the risk side, then there's the broader set of issues in terms of how do we as society harness the power of finance to help solve the problem. But from a risk perspective, one thing that many people don't know, and I can understand that why would they pay that close attention to it, but what they don't know is that the Bank of England oversees the insurance industry, and therefore Lloyd's of London, plus the property and casualty insurance industry in the UK insurance industry is the fourth largest in the world. If you oversee the insurance industry, if you underwrite risk for property and for natural disasters, you are the experts in climate change. You're at the front line of that. You adjust basically on a yearly basis the price, which tends to go up, and the coverage, which tends to go down, against climate risk, because these risks have more than tripled over the course of the last 3 decades. When I say these risks, I mean extreme weather events. The cost, even adjusted for for inflation rather, has gone up more than 5-fold. So there's huge exposure, and there's been an adjustment there. So there's the actual physical manifestation of climate risk. But the bigger risk actually is that we have an economy that is still geared or still heavily reliant on fossil fuels, that is still producing far too many greenhouse gases. In fact, any greenhouse gases ultimately is too many if we're going to stabilize the climate. And there is the question of how do we get from where we are today to where we need to get to stabilize the climate, in other words, net zero. And as a risk, that's called transition risk, because what you want is a smooth transition to where we need to go, a predictable and steady and credible transition. And the risk is that we leave it too late and have to make a very sharp adjustment. And we're close to that. We're close to having left it too late. And so what we need to do as the bank, and what we saw several years ago, was at a minimum, the financial industry needed the information to do the types of things that James Bardwick was talking about at the start, to determine how to take risk, recognizing that some industries, if they don't make investments today, will not be viable tomorrow in a world where we're reducing carbon. Now, I won't give a long answer here, but I'll just put a marker. This is all about risk and what the central banks and the banks should do effectively. There's a huge other set of issues for the financial system, which is a much more positive agenda. It's less about avoiding risk, but it's about investing in the industries of the future, the technologies of the future. And I mean, I'll simplify it. If climate change is an existential risk, which it is, and you see many of those manifestations in the Arctic, if you are part of the solution to an existential risk, you are creating a tremendous amount of value. And that's the bit of the huge part of this that is only just beginning to be realized, I think, in the financial sector. And we need to put in place, and this is our agenda for Glasgow, is to put in place what's needed for the financial industry to get behind people and companies, governments, regions, countries that have solutions.
No, for sure. I think one of the interesting points that you made there, you talked about creating value, and I'm going to sort of hook onto that for a moment, because we're also enjoying your Wreath lectures at the moment, where you've been talking about the importance of what it is we value and how we value. And in particular, the importance of separating out market value or price from social value. I'm just interested to probe you a little bit on that and ask for you, what's the relevance of what we value and how we value for the debate on climate change?
Yeah, it's so much of what is being destroyed is not valued, not explicitly valued. So I referenced biodiversity a moment ago in terms of numbers of species lost, and there's not a price tag on those species. And we can come back to the value of whether or not one would put a price tag on it, but that's not valued. And in fact, it's really only been as physical capital, real estate, ports, sea lines, coastlines have been damaged because of climate change, that it's become very present and apparent. I mean, we had these horrible wildfires, if we remember. I mean, it's only a year ago we had these wildfires in Australia, as an example, where there was tremendous ecological destruction. But there was also just fundamental physical destruction as well, and both of those, one had a price tag, the other had no price tag. So there was an issue in terms of how what's in the market, in other words, what's valued, and what the urgency that's created when something that has a pound value or dollar value on it is destroyed or at risk, and that creates, versus that which is more intangible, more sacred, which isn't in the market, and is not formally valued. That's the first thing. The second is, we are all, I go back to my procrastination point, or we all have issues in terms of discounting the future, taking action for the future, and how much we value the future, and how much we value the planet we're leaving to the next generation, for example, and how tangible is that sentiment. I mean, I think we all have the sentiment, but what actions are we actually going to take consistent with that? And I think the third thing, which I try to get across in the Wreath lectures, is that there's a very economic way there's a core economic way of looking at virtually any problem, which is to optimize against costs and benefits and balance things out so that the marginal benefit you're receiving is just the same as the marginal cost of the activity. And there's a lot of merit in that approach. But it falls down on issues of fundamental value. It falls down on issues, for example, in my judgment, around COVID and the crisis we're going through. We're not marginally trading off a pound value of somebody's life versus a pound of GDP. Society has made that judgment, and I fully support it. We're protecting as many lives as possible, and then within that hierarchy, trying to create as much activity and preserve as many jobs and livelihoods subject to that. For a very long period of time, my whole life, certainly, while we've been aware of the issues around climate change, we have in effect been trading off planet and profit, and getting the value, optimizing against the two. I think we're now moving to a position, and it's credit to people, social movements ultimately manifesting, and ultimately governments following that, to say, we have a clear objective, a hierarchy of value. We have a clear objective. We're going to address climate change. The law of the land in this country is net zero by 2050. It's becoming the law of land in the country I'm in right now, Canada. They've just introduced the legislation. There's 124 other countries that have net zero objectives. President-elect Biden has made it clear that he intends to have a net zero objective. So the world's coming together and saying, okay, it's not planet versus profit, it's planet first, get to net zero. How can the market and others, government, but also the market, serve achieving that goal? And that is a different way of looking at value. It's moving from the flattening of value, the traditional economic approach, which is suitable for many, many cases, and I would apply it in many, many cases. But for something as fundamental and existential as health and climate, it's not appropriate. And it's to the credit of people that when they were pressed earlier this year with the health crisis, they very clearly chose health of people they didn't know, and also to their credit that the similar thing has happened now with climate.
No, interesting. And I think one of the interesting things there is when is it appropriate to put an economic value on something? And one of the arguments I'm often sort of economists will say to me is, well, listen, we may get a lot of things wrong, but we're very good at making trade-offs and we're very good at making choices. And we talked about, you mentioned biodiversity earlier, and one of the criticisms of the climate debate is it's crowded out discussion on biodiversity, but obviously as you've been referencing, that is also a very critical issue. And some economists have been arguing that in order to protect biodiversity and the ecosystems that support it, we have to recognize them as assets and put an economic value on their natural capital as we do our economic capital. Now that puts them in the same register, but I was just wondering, given what you were just saying on value, are the risks with that approach? So if we try to attribute an economic value to the natural environment, including biodiversity, do we just continue trading off the future to the present and nature against economic growth?
Yeah. So it's a fantastic question, and it's a fundamental issue. I think the first thing, one of the things you said in the lead up to it, which I think bears repeating, which is the relationship, calling to mind the relationship between addressing climate change and biodiversity. Yeah. So addressing climate change is supportive of biodiversity, but it is not, it's necessary but not sufficient to be an economist around it. And quite often more needs to be done in order to promote and think about even some of the climate solutions around, or part of the climate solution would be reforestation. Well, there's obviously different types of reforestation, and highly efficient monoculture reforestation does not promote biodiversity the same as some of the alternatives. So it's important to acknowledge that up front, that we are going to lose tremendous, and we are losing, sadly, tremendous biodiversity because of climate change. One of the things, if I flip from the Arctic to the tropics, which always strikes me, is just the horrific expectations on and what's happening around coral reefs, and even with success, sub 2 degrees, stabilizing temperatures below 2 degrees, it's in the orders of magnitude of 3/4 to 90% of reefs becoming non-viable because of that warming and the salination of the ocean, which is a shocking hit to. Yeah. But it could be even worse, and that's what's at play now. But to go to the fundamental question that you're asking, and the value of putting the value of value in nature, and there is a lot of work, and this is a rapidly evolving field, and I think and there's a lot of good in this field. Mm-hmm. I will flag a caution about it at the end, but let me just cite some of the good, which is just the act of doing these calculations gives us a sense of how out of whack we have become. And I know that some figures that I believe were in the interim report by Professor Partha Dasgupta, his work on biodiversity for the Treasury, is that basically in the 2 decades in the run-up, 2 decades to 2014, I think it is, we doubled the physical capital globally of the economy. and human capital went up by 15 or so percent, which surprises me it was that little, but apparently that's the calculation. But our natural capital went down by at least 40% in 20 years. And just being conscious of those balance sheets and be conscious of, I mean, actually, I would reinforce the human capital is interesting as well. Let's take that as accurate, but being conscious of the natural capital balance sheet, whether it's in, a county or the UK or globally, and judgments being made about whether or not governments or companies are subtracting or adding to that natural capital. In other words, do they view themselves to go back to where we started, apart from nature or part of nature, integrated to nature? Can you just take? So I think there is tremendous value to that. There is also value, and Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary, has done some work through his institute on estimates of the proportion of the global economy that is nature dependent, partially or wholly nature dependent, and it's virtually half. Now, that's not entirely surprising given the weight of agriculture, but I mean, it tells you that if there's material climate change, you have that effect on a substantial proportion of the economy. But I still haven't answered your core question, which is, I've said a lot, but I haven't answered the question. And normally, as a central bank governor, I would just stop here and say, I think that I think there is great value in these valuations. I think it's dangerous to mix financial valuations with the secular and the sacred in this regard, and I feel that the discipline of accounting for whether we're adding or subtracting from biodiversity is quite valuable. I think that as you merge the two, quite clearly we'll get into situations where the value of a certain species of newt will be £1 billion, and the net present value of my profits if I destroy the newt are £1.1 billion. And am I so confident in that valuation that it justifies? That's one issue. The second issue is that if you merge all of these values, there's judgments in making these values, but if you merge all these values and you end up with one true number, which is, or what's viewed as one true number, a profit or a loss, you've missed all of the assumptions and the judgments that are made up the chain, which makes it more difficult. I will, though, come back. Maybe I'll let you take back control of the, so to speak, of the conversation, and I'll come back to an aspect of this if we have time. Around markets.
For sure. So listen, we've covered a huge amount of ground, and just before we open up the Q&A, I just wanted to ask you one last question. And just for those who are listening, if you do want to ask a question, then just use the chat function, the Q&A function, and I'll be able to put those to Mark. But so I suppose we've covered a huge amount of ground, and I just want to, and the problems are vast and extremely complicated. So I just wanted to ask you the really straightforward question of what are the 2 or 3 most important things that government and societies need to do right now to mobilize the kind of transformative system-wide changes that we need in order to reach net zero and protect our environment and biodiversity?
Yeah, I think some of this has been done in the UK, but since it's the projection, this can project more broadly, and we're hosting the world for COP. I think we should say the following. First is make it absolutely clear what the objective is. So in other words, this hierarchy of objectives, and that we're going for net zero, and net zero that's consistent with 1.5 degrees, and that because that becomes that orients what is expected of the country as a whole. So if where I'm in Canada, some of the debate has been, well, does Canada have a sufficient plan in order to meet net zero, to be on track for net zero? And the judgment has been that it hasn't, and part of the reason is for recent government actions here have been because of that judgment, and it's the discipline of that focus. And where it extends to is into the financial sector and the real economy. So the first is to have that objective. I think the second is to ask of our companies, what's your plan? So what's your plan for net zero? Because you really, as a company, have a choice if you're operating in any of the 126 countries in the world, and I would argue full stop. Either you don't think you can operate your business consistent with a net zero economy, and you're going to run it off over the course of the next decade or so. That's a logical and honest assessment. In some cases, that might be the case. Or you have a plan to move towards net zero, consistent with net zero. You disclose what the impact could be on you, your best judgment, and what you're going to do about it. And in some industries, to be honest, they will depend on future innovation in order to be competitive. But that in and of itself is valuable because it shines a light on what needs to be done, where young researchers should concentrate their efforts, where more entrepreneurial investors should focus their energies, and that will help address it. I mean, and to be honest, the third option is that for a company is to, if they don't have a plan and they're not explicitly running down their company, they're basically saying they're separate from society. So not only are they separate from the economy, they're separate from society and their objective. And I think we can judge the merits of those institutions. And the third thing is, I think we all need to do is that what society needs to do is we need to organize our financial system in a way that it is relentlessly focused on this issue, that it recognizes that it's one of the biggest drivers of value in companies and risks in companies. And since it's all of our money, everyone listening, it's your money ultimately, whether it's in a pension pot, a big bank, your own ISA as you invest, it's your money. And so ask the question, what's your plan? What's your plan for the bank or building society in terms of net zero? What's the plan for if I invest in a company, do they have a plan for net zero? Or if I work for a company or an organization, what's the plan? And just having that singular focus, and that's what drives change, and that's what makes it tangible at the local level. And of course, what it also does is it turns a problem into an opportunity because people are focused on what needs to be done in order to achieve it. And I'm optimistic in that I think we're seeing some of that dynamic already.
Thank you very much for that. And right, so I'm now going to turn over to questions. And Mark, as you can imagine, we've got a whole stack of questions which have been coming in. I'm going to pick up one just on the, it always arises, and it goes to the companies and what's your plan? And this time it's in relation to those oil and gas companies, BP and Shell, in terms of their ambitions for net zero whilst continuing to invest in exploration for hydrocarbons. And so very question which is coming in from a number of what are the steps that need to be taken in relation to those fossil fuel companies in particular in relation to their own activities and delivering plans aligned with net zero.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, and it's a hugely important question, and it's a question where we're only starting to get the answers to, or at least the information with which we can make judgments, whether it's the questioner, you or I, the institutions where we put our money, society, stakeholders as a whole, and we're starting from the position we're in. Where we have a fossil fuel, hydrocarbon dependent economy. We need to rapidly get to renewable economy, effectively electrify everything we can and make all of electrification renewable. Some of these companies may be part of the solution, the conditional, that not saying they will be part of the solution, they may be part of the solution. If they have strategies that is going to take the cash flows from their old businesses and reinvest them and build up what society needs, then they merit the question, the judgment of, okay, is this management credible? Is the strategy credible? And is it better to back that strategy as part of the solution? And I'm not obviously going to endorse a particular company here or there. It wouldn't be appropriate. In some cases, the answer may well be yes. In other cases, it will be no. And it's for the companies that don't have a strategy, that aren't acknowledging this, the core question to them, if they're in the energy sector, hydrocarbon dependent. So how long you're unwinding your company over what period? 10 years, 15 years, just let us know, because the terminal value, if the UK, if the world's going to get to net zero of those companies, is zero. The terminal value, by just so we're on the same page, terminal value is the value of the company in the distant future. And the terminal value of a company that's trying to become a renewable company and part of the solution is potentially very, very high. And what we are seeing, and maybe I should make a point of just to ground this in some substance, is that the cost of capital for those companies. So if I'm a energy company that invests offshore oil and gas and heavy and quite GHG intensive energy, my cost of raising funds is as much as 4 times the cost of a renewable energy company today. 4 times. It's a huge difference. So what's happening is the pressure is there and the opportunity is here. If here is the renewable and the pressure is on the energy company. And that's going to drive change. But if there is an energy company that has a solution, a commitment, and a plan to be a solution, then, at least in my judgment, that some may reasonably want to back them because that is part of the answer.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That as you said, that is there, and that is their plan. One of the other questions, or groups of questions which are coming in, are around aspects in relation to carbon credits and also carbon trading. So one question, so I'll put these together. So one is about carbon credits. Are you worried that they will be couched as a greenwash by rich nations, which are most to blame for climate crisis? And somebody wants to know what you personally are going to do about it. And then another question, which is, how do you see carbon trading playing a role in achieving net zero, and how will you see it quickly? Will you expect to see that happening or being scaled up?
Yeah.
So we've got 2 dimensions similar.
So it's just that we're all talking about the same thing. There is a market that exists today for so-called carbon offsets and nature-based solutions. So the simplest example, and there are many different types, that's one of the issues, but is I reforest, I plant a forest, and while that forest is growing, it's taking net carbon out of the atmosphere. And can I sell a offset credit to somebody to help pay for the cost of me developing this forest? That's in effect, I'm simplifying, but in effect, that's a question. And that market is tiny right now. It's 300 million pounds, give or take. And it needs to be on the order of magnitude of 50 to 100 billion a year. In order for a couple of things. And this is a crucial point. This is a transitional market. It is not the end solution. It's preserving our very limited carbon budget for a period of time, while companies make the very large investments, or the economy as a whole makes the very large investments that are needed to go from where we are today to where we need to get to by net zero. So it helps bridge that gap and create some time for us to get there and take carbon out of the atmosphere while it's doing so. So it's definitely not the end solution. It's transitional, but transitional for decades in quite a large size if we get it right. So we are working to get it right. So there is, and this goes to part of the question, so there is no greenwashing, so that the forest is really there, that it's not just planted, but it grows, that it's still there a decade from now, 20 years from now, that the coal plant is converted to renewables, not to a just slightly better coal plant, if you will, and that we actually get the reduction in carbon that we need. I think two things, though, about this. One is this is a market for companies, the market for companies. So a company has a plan, says, I'm going to get to net zero. By the way, Julia, it's going to take me 10 years to turn off this plant, build up the new plant that runs on hydrogen, and I'm going to, do X with my power. It is going to take a bit of time. But in the meantime, while I'm making those investments, I am going to be reducing my carbon footprint because I'm going to be buying these offsets. But when I put that in my annual report, you know this well, it better be there. It can't be there and then gone tomorrow. It cannot be greenwashing. It has to be real. We need a professional market. That's the first thing. Second is a lot of these investments will be in developing economies because that will be the cheapest and most effective way to reduce carbon. And that is hugely beneficial. And the third thing, to go back to our biodiversity discussion, is actually what I expect we will see is the core of this market it's all about taking carbon out of the atmosphere. But in some cases, there's big, quote, co-benefits because I have a forest or a mangrove swamp or, so-called blue carbon opportunity, which enhances biodiversity. Now, I'm not necessarily going to get paid for that, except from a social return. I could get paid for it. They could develop that market for it. But my personal view is that it's more likely to be a social return for not just having reduced carbon, but actually promoted greater biodiversity, acting as if I'm integrated, as I am integrated with nature. And then the last thing I'll say is, my view is, since asked my personal view is, if this market properly develops, the value of the offset is to the company that has bought it, so it shows up in their accounts. And let's say in my example of the forest is in Indonesia. It's planted in Indonesia, it grows in Indonesia, it takes out carbon in it. Then from a country accounting perspective, it's Indonesian. Right? Indonesia is different. There's no double counting. It's, if you want to count on geography, it's Indonesia, or on a country basis, Indonesia. If you want to count as a company, it shows up in that company's annual report. If you just want to count about the planet, there's only one reduction of carbon, which is the amount of taken by the forest. So it's an important market, but it's no more than 5, 10, let's say at best 10% of the solution for a period of decades. Well, we are getting to absolute zero, basically, while we're getting these technologies up and running and turning over our plant and equipment in a way that's going to run a truly sustainable economy. Yeah.
So it connects very well, actually, to a question which has also come in, which is linked to that, but I was just going to pose it to you to see if you want to expand, I suppose, in a little way, is if we're disconnected to nature now, are there levers that exist in a financial system to get that connection back?
Interesting. I think the first thing in terms of being disconnected, this is going to sound like an odd answer, but I think it's my answer. It's my answer. This is my final answer.
Go for it.
Okay. Which is, part of the disconnect is a personal disconnect. Part of the disconnect is not actually experiencing nature, how well is nature integrated in our curricula, the sort of connection to nature is partly a virtue, by which I mean it's a lived experience. Virtue expands with the practice. Being connected to nature expands with, I'm sure there's some gardeners out there, they feel much more connected to nature than those who don't regularly interact. And to go back to the north, to the Arctic, you can't but interact with nature if you live in the Arctic, unless you literally stay inside all the time, which is not a sustainable solution. So you have to interact, which is why it's followed strongly. So I think the first part of my answer is there is a personal element to it. And I think this is going to be part of the it was part of the interim report of, again, Professor Dasgupta looking at these broader issues of biodiversity, and part of the solution. It's not the silver bullet solution. There's many things required. From a financial perspective, so one of the things that is developing on the financial side is the work that the Bank of England has done and that I've worked on around climate-related disclosure has focused around ultimately material financial risk. So and part of the insight of it, if I can put it that way, has been there may not be the physical risk today, but there's these transition risks tomorrow, and you need to plan today to address them. And if they're material tomorrow, it's material today that you take the steps to address them. Okay, I think that makes sense. There's a school of thought, there's more than a school of thought, there's actual policies that are being put in place in Europe where they say, okay, that's financial materiality. Ultimately, it matters to your bottom line, even if it's not today, it's in the future, therefore think about it today. But they also say, is it material from a sustainability perspective? In other words, is what you're doing today, it may not, in the end, to go back to my newt example, if it's slightly tortured, but my newt example, it may not affect your bottom line today, and it might not affect your bottom line down the road. But is it material from a sustainability or biodiversity perspective? And if it is, you have to disclose it. So you have to stand up and say, actually, my industrial process has this impact of using, changing the watershed in some way. You can tell I'm not a biologist, but in a way that...
I'll just nod in a very knowledgeable way, Mark. Way off our ground here.
Let's all pretend this makes sense. In a way that materially damages the habitat of this species or species. I have to disclose that. That's what the new European, it's called the Non-Financial Disclosure Directive, says. Well, okay, then in the financial system, you have that information, and all stakeholders have that information. And then you're saying, well, okay, it doesn't affect the bottom line, but does it affect the social license of the company? Yeah. Could it affect the social license of the company down the road? And if so, if you're having this material impact on sustainability, biodiversity, shouldn't you do something about it? And then that sets up a mechanism by which something is dynamically material, to use a fancy term for something which is just obvious, is the knowledge by stakeholders of this impact causes a reaction. And that is one way. I'm giving a very personal level answer, which is actually the way to be connected with nature is actually to smell the flowers, literally, or plant the flowers and smell the flowers. But then this more formal way, which would move through the financial system.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Now, so the question has also come in, because we've been focusing there quite a lot on companies and then how people respond to that information, and the idea that they will then incorporate that information in making their choices, and then our asset allocation will shift its balance to move towards the new societal goal and our new hierarchy of values. But one of the questions that has come in, and again, very pertinent, relevant question, which is somebody asking they're interested to hear how you think we could manage to persuade people in wealthy nations that actually our lifestyles need to change. Our long-haul flights, our meat consumption, our energy consumption, etc. That actually it's us also that needs to change. We can't hand this over just to companies or to others or to governments to make those choices. How do we drive that home to us all as individuals? Yeah,
I think it starts with awareness, it's interesting, there are products that are developing, actually products now just in the market, and one of the major credit card companies has this where, the extent to which, and obviously it's in their interest that you run all your transactions through their credit card, but if you run all your transactions through their credit card, they tell you the carbon footprint of your lifestyle, which is, I guess you'd have to calculate your house and maybe your auto as well, but other than that, you're more or less covered. So there is the awareness aspect to it. I think that the company what has changed, you can say something positive, which is that what has changed for some of the major consumer products companies. So one of the major consumer products companies, you can probably guess who it is, formerly Anglo-Dutch, incredibly focused on their environmental footprint. But for many of their products, there is no mention of this, or there had been no mention of this. And that was partly because the judgment of consumers 10 years back, at least, was that if something was green, it was either not as good or more expensive. Just the instant association for many people was that.
Yeah.
And that has now shifted. It's slightly generational. There is, I hate that, sort of the older generation is still in that camp. But if you start slicing the other generations, it shifts into maybe my generation wants to buy green, but doesn't always, right? So still has a trace of that. Where you get Gen X will buy green, will default to green, if there's an option. And the Gen Zennials will never buy anything that isn't green. I mean, as a whole, obviously there's exceptions, but and so you see that change that's there. So there's a greater awareness of those aspects. I think one thing, I'll make one other comment though, if I may, which is a slight non sequitur, but it goes to lifestyle, which I do think that there are elements of identity. There's hierarchy of how we remove, we make progress, and then there's there's elements of identity, and there's certain aspects of lifestyle. And I don't mean jetting around the world and having massive carbon footprints, but around diet and others, which are important, but they are not yet decisive in terms of. There are some big low-hanging fruit that come first, and then some aspects of diet go straight to identity, certain cultures or ways that people live, and it's just not clear to me, and I'm just being transparent, it's not like my view on this matters, but that's the first thing I would go for, which is to tell people you've got to radically change your lifestyle in order for us to survive. There are things you can do to reduce it, and there are big things we need to do in our economy in order to reduce it, and there's going to have to be changes. And in the fullness of time, yes, we're going to have to move to with society more plant-based and other diets to be consistent. It's just, I'm not sure I would start with that. The question didn't start with that, but I'm just volunteering.
No, for sure. So listen, Mark, we have many more questions than we'll be able to answer. But we're running up against time. So this is going to be the last question. But it's one which invites you to be optimistic. It asks, what makes you most optimistic about the future? And in particular, going to that younger generation point that you raised, and the question is, what would you say to the younger generation who feel frustrated that we, those of our generation, haven't dealt with these issues to date?
I would. I would.
Sorry.
No, it's fair. It's fair. Well, first off, I do think that movements like Fridays for Futures have had an enormous impact, and in a way that I think one of the things, partly a tipping point on social movements and activity, including of governments, but also. And it's on a personal level, but it's on a mass personal level, if I can put it that way. So one of the experiences that I've had over the course of the last 18 months, and it's really only been over that period around these issues, is that in the discussions which have shifted, in the discussions with companies, large financial institutions, et cetera, the discussion has moved very much to the CEO. He or she is very knowledgeable about the issue, wants to sort it out, and quite often will add a sort of personal reflection about their children and their priorities and just being back in line intergenerationally about solving this issue. Now, it tends to be the case that some fairly substantial things get done, and the judgment of the younger generation is, well, you haven't done anything. So I guess I'd rather have them keep pushing than say, okay, that's enough, and you can take your take your eye off it. I think the from a financial perspective, I guess the only thing I would say is the younger generation and all of us really should know how our money is being put to work. And is it part of the solution or is it still part of the problem? And if your bank or pension fund, ISA provider, doesn't know the answer, why don't they know the answer? This is the issue. It's the issue for our economy. It's the intergenerational issue, and it's also a huge opportunity as well. If you're part of the solution, people will do well by that. But you should know the answer to the question, and you would be doing a great service, not just for your own money, but also you'd make. And this is not why you should do it, but this is what we're trying to do for Glasgow: is to get everyone in line so they know how their money's working. Is it part of the solution or part of the problem? And how do you flip? If it's part of the problem, how do you flip it from one to the other? And just having that pressure from thousands, hundreds of thousands of voices will really make a difference, because you've already made a difference in terms of the overall objective.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. There are many more questions, so thank you everybody who has been firing their questions in. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm sorry we haven't managed to get through all of them, but we have covered a huge amount of ground, and you've given us an awful lot to think about. So thank you very much for your. It's been a delight talking to you as well this evening.
It's been my pleasure, and it's good to see you again. And I want to thank again the British Academy and the British Museum for this, and it's great. And I'm sorry we can't all get in all the time to see it, but next best thing is doing it online, so I recommend it.
Exactly so. Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye.